For the first stage of the revolution, what we might call the Liberal Revolution, reforms undertaken by the National Assembly had been, with some exceptions, narrowly political in nature. Even so, the scope of these reforms was extensive. Let it not be said that abolishing the nobility, enshrining a constitution, or constraining the Gallic Church were not extremely consequential. Rationalization and modernization were the orders of the day after all. But these reforms had limits. Though the liberal revolutionaries of the constitutional order eagerly eviscerated the Ancien regime, they were remiss to go further. As we've seen, their unwillingness to tackle the underlying social causes of the revolution saw them replaced by revolutionaries with a social bent. Revolutionaries who were more than willing to take a chunk out of the sacred cows the liberals had deemed off limits. Now, in mid-1793, the convention will begin a process of de-Christianization across France. This was couched in seemingly conflicting terms. Firstly, it was meant to continue with the general rationalization and modernization wrought by the revolution. And secondly, de-Christianization was meant to unshackle the people from counter-revolutionary Catholic morality, and then replace it with an invented revolutionary morality. It must of course be noted that they were building upon the National Assembly's civil constitution of the clergy. But the important distinction is that while the civil constitution severely weakened the Gallic Church, it did not destroy the Gallic Church. The National Assembly wasn't looting churches, as would the convention. The Assembly's goal was to subordinate the Gallic Church and reduce their influence over state affairs. They did this by making clergymen beholden to the state as salaried civil servants, and then by confiscating and selling the church's land. The general anti-clerical streak of successive revolutionary governments had only strengthened since then. As we've seen, literally all of our leading revolutionaries were explicitly anti-clerical, quite willing to enact anti-clerical legislation, and then during the Terror use the Revolutionary Tribunal to oppress the clergy, specifically the non-juring priests. This was of course a culmination of the Enlightenment's own anti-clericalism, which stressed a separation of church and state. But the word to note here is separation. Scarcely any pre-revolutionary Enlightenment thinkers were espousing the destruction of the church. What they abhorred was organized religion, the brutal dogma that came with it, and how that dogma wormed its way into policy. Certainly, many Jacobins conceived of religion in these terms, and believed that they had already successfully separated church and state. Their more radical members, however, joined with the Enragés in demanding something very strange, a kind of extreme compromise. They wanted to destroy Christianity in France, but not with the aim of destroying religious dogma, in line with Enlightenment values. Rather, they wanted to replace one religion with another. In a very literal sense, they wanted the revolution to become a religion. From among these radical Jacobins, the two leading proponents of de-Christianization were Pierre Chaumette and Joseph Fouché. We were introduced to these two last time when they visited the Terror upon Lyon. Pierre Chaumette was a native of Nevers in south-central France, and born into a family of shoemakers. As with so many of our revolutionaries, he was meant to become a priest, but turned from this path, and eventually, after spending some years on a merchant vessel, Chaumette found himself in the service of an English doctor, and eventually trained in the natural sciences. This led him to Paris as a medical student, where, in 1790, he first came into contact with the revolution. Chaumette joined the political underground and became a fixture of the Courrier Club, later going on to join the Jacobin Club. This gave him something of a unique position, as both a sans-culotte and a Jacobin. Naturally, of course, he became very popular, and won numerous important offices and appointments over the next few years, always pushing the hardest of hard lines. This brought him into contact and almost complete alignment with the Enragés, particularly Jacques Hébert. There's some debate on just how deep this connection went, but whether or not Chaumette was an Hébertiste or just Hébert's ally doesn't really matter, because they were both on the same page. In early September, he had in fact joined a demonstration staged by Hébert, calling for extremely radical measures to be taken against counter-revolutionaries. Chaumette first popped onto Joseph Fouché's radar around the same time. And just to recap, Joseph Fouché was a former priest in training, turned strident opponent of the church. The young radical found Fouché whilst he was a representative on mission serving in Nevers, and broached to him the idea of wholesale de-Christianization. Fouché was all ears. Nevers would be his test case. On September 22nd, Fouché delivered a powerful speech to a packed crowd within the church of Saint-Cyr. In it, he declared that religion was sophistry, and imperiled the moral character of honest Frenchmen. Particular scrutiny was heaped on the priests themselves, whom Fouché declaimed for their celibacy. The revolutionary authorities had already done a great deal to promote civil services and ceremonies, separate from religious ones. But Fouché went even further, and said that priestly celibacy and homophobia ought to be eliminated. These were not mere words either. Over the next few days, Fouché had church services suspended, while the churches themselves were raided for valuables and for religious symbols. The religious symbols were destroyed. Feeling hemmed in, about 30 priests retired after they refused Fouché's orders to swear off celibacy and marry, or otherwise contribute to society in a more meaningful manner by supporting orphans or the elderly. Chaumette, having witnessed Fouché's program firsthand, sought to export it back to Paris. So he went to his friend Hébert and quickly convinced him to endorse dechristianization in the capital. Indeed, Chaumette's proposal really struck a chord with Hébert. The Hébertists and the Enragés more generally had a very extreme anti-clerical line started by yet another ex-priest, Jacques Roux. But perhaps more pressingly, dechristianization squared nicely with the Hébertists' anti-capitalist rhetoric. The hatred of grain hoarders, speculators and the like could easily extend out to include priests, who had supposedly lived lives of incredible luxury off of the hard work of the peasants. Now we know that this depiction applies accurately to the robed clergy and not so much to the lay clergy. But the distinction didn't matter. Hébert's point was to invade the people against the church. In subsequent editions of Père Duchesne, Hébert would go to the logical extreme, describing Christians as fanatical and in league with counter-revolutionaries. It didn't take much convincing to get the radical sections on side, and attacks against both churches and priests increased markedly throughout June. Still, it was a narrow sliver of Parisians who were truly convinced of priestly duplicity, and fewer still who were willing to commit acts of violence. These acts of violence against the church, even if they were encouraged by popular demagogues, fell far short of any kind of systematized institutional dechristianization. If such a thing were to occur, it would have to come from the convention. And so it now would, as two themes of convention policy began to converge. Dechristianization was the result of the desire to distance the nation from the Ancien Regime through both rationalization and then the destruction of non-revolutionary symbols. So this is going to need some explaining. On the agenda for every successive revolutionary government was the need to repudiate the Ancien Regime, distancing France from its monarchical past. Initially, it had been sufficient to merely reform and rationalize, but now the Republican authorities found it necessary to complement this rationalizing campaign with a symbolic effacing of the past. This meant things like removing statues, renaming streets, and so on. By mid-1793, the National Convention had removed pretty well all the symbols of royal power. That was all except for one, the Gallic Church. Through the civil constitution of the clergy, it was certainly the case that the church was subservient to the state, but its odious prior connections to the monarchy were still extant. And as many priests openly sided with the Vendée rebels, proclaimed in favour of the boy King Louis XVII, or supported the Federalists, there came a realization that perhaps even a subservient church was still a threat. So the convention's turning on the Catholic Church coincided with the Hébertist anti-clericalism, turning dechristianization, a niche populist policy, into a concrete nationwide policy. Such a huge leap into literally dechristianizing France was not made overnight. It took some pilot policies to lay the groundwork. So to set the stage, French scientists had, since the revolution began, been trying to unify the various systems of weights and measurements used not just in their own scientific pursuits, but also in commerce and agriculture. Their goal was not merely to rationalize things, but also to make this system universal, thus facilitating the kind of international mathematical language we enjoy today. Like my Australian kilometre is the same as an Indian kilometre, that sort of thing. After much ado, the French did adopt their finalized system, called the metric system, as it was decimalized, meaning based around the number 10. With the example set by the metric system, some revolutionaries proposed extending it out to include timekeeping. This would, supposedly, rid France of yet more lingering royalist influence, but also further rationalize things. Win-win. So the convention decided to replace the old Gregorian calendar with a decimalized revolutionary calendar. The task of designing this new system fell to Danton's protégé, Fabre d'Églantine. Building upon proposals from prior years, Églantine changed pretty well everything, only retaining the 12 months of the year. Now there would be 10 hours to a day, 10 days to a week, with a week now being called a decade, and 3 such decades to a month. Extra days at the end of the year would be added up and called the Days of the Sans-Culottes, a time of revolutionary celebration. Debate on where to start the calendar did flare up. Some wanted it dated from June 6, 1789, or even July 14th of the same year. The majority, however, wanted the calendar to start from the establishment of the Republic, so September 21, 1792. This would make 1793 year 2 of the Republic. As far as naming conventions, Églantine felt it necessary to highlight the Republic's reliance upon natural order and reason rather than Christianity. Every season would have 3 months, with each month named something thematically appropriate. So for autumn there was Vendémiaire, meaning something like vintage, Brumaire, derived from the French word brume, meaning mist, and Frimaire, from the French for frost. This would then continue. Winter had Nivos, Pluvos, and Ventos. Spring had Germinal, Floreal, and Priral. Summer had Messidor, Thermidor, and Fructidor. The establishment of this revolutionary calendar was the opening shot in the convention's de-Christianization campaign, as it did two important things. Firstly, it eliminated the Sabbath, Sundays as the traditional Catholic day of rest and worship. It also got rid of all other religious holidays like Easter and Christmas. 2. It also got rid of the calendar of saints, in which each day of the year was named after a particular saint. Again, this tied into Eglantine's desire to associate the calendar with nature. We thought that the nation, after having kicked out this canonized mob from its calendar, must replace it with the objects that make up the true riches of the nation. Worthy objects, not from a cult, but from agriculture. Useful products of the soil, the tools that we use to cultivate it, and the domesticated animals, our faithful servants in these works. Animals much more precious, without doubt, to the eye of reason, than the beautified skeletons pulled from the catacombs of Rome. Henceforth, days would be named after fruits, plants, flowers, and rocks. Days literally called rhubarb, granite, honey, jasmine, stuff like that. This was a nice system, but it sounds more at home in Lord of the Rings than the real world. The Gregorian calendar used at the time, and which we use today, was simply an improved version of the Julian calendar, which itself was an improved version of the original Roman calendar, which in turn was based upon the Egyptian agricultural calendar. And the Egyptians created their calendar in accordance with the seasons, meaning you know when to sow, when to harvest, when to let your fields rest, and when to plant what seeds. Eglantine's revolutionary calendar retained the seasonal distinction, thankfully, but did end up causing problems for French agriculture. This factor, as well as a general unwillingness to change, and severe resistance to de-Christianization, as we're about to see, doomed the Republican calendar to niche use. It would be officially abolished in 1801, but had already fallen out of widespread use by 1795. There was also the problem that priests refused to use the Republican calendar. Well, I say problem, it may well have been intentional. When the priests refused to hold Mass on the 10th day and encouraged their congregations to follow the old calendar, the convention took this as proof of their counter-revolutionary antics. Inciting these fears was of course Chaumette and Hébert. With widespread resistance from the clergy, they couldn't have asked for better proof of their point that de-Christianization had to be rolled out in full. Following through, the convention had the Paris Commune enact de-Christianization in Paris. Statues and monuments dedicated to Christianity were toppled, churches were raided for their valuables and then shut down, Catholic iconography, images of the Madonna mostly, were replaced with images of revolutionary martyrs like Marat. Furthermore, the Catholic grift of selling religious artifacts, selling Jesus' fingers in boxes of 10, well, that was outlawed. Open displays of anti-clerical sentiment became commonplace. The burning of an effigy of the Pope, heckling of a bishop, blockading the church, and even theatrical performances making fun of Mass. The flames of popular upheaval were of course fanned by Jacques Hébert, but he was joined by another populist demagogue, Antoine-François Montmoreau. Montmoreau has been lurking in the background of our story so far, working chiefly as the printer for radical newspapers. Namely, he printed Marat's L'Âme du Peuple and Hébert's Père Duchesne. So no surprise, but Montmoreau was a radical populist and aligned with Marat. But Marat's assassination drove Montmoreau into the arms of Hébert, and he became an outspoken leader of the Hébertists. This allowed him to be elected to the directorship of the Paris Commune, which put him centre stage in November of 1793. As a propagandist by trade, Montmoreau focused on propaganda. He had the slogan, "Unity, indivisibility of the Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity," displayed on all public buildings, especially churches. This tied into Chaumette's continued efforts, and by early November, Montmoreau was organising celebrations to honour revolutionary martyrs and Republican virtues. Some smaller celebrations were held, but the largest yet of these so-called Festivals of Reason was held in the Notre Dame on November 10th. A young actress was attired in Roman fashion with a white silk toga and wore the Phrygian cap on her head. She was the, quote, goddess of reason. Escorted by sans-culottes and women dressed in rose inlaid dresses, she waited atop a throne as revolutionary songs were sung and drunken dedications made to Marat, Lepeletier, and more recently, Chalier. Naturally, the people were very enthused by all this, and other festivals of reason were held over the next few days. This included a festival in the church of Saint-Sulpice, in which Sophie Montmoreau, the wife of Antoine François, played the role of the goddess of reason. These successes emboldened both the Commune and Chaumette, and thus the decision was made to carry out de-Christianization to its fullest extent. On November 15th, or thereabouts, all of Paris's churches were shuttered. Some were reopened over the next few weeks, but as temples of reason, again intended to celebrate the revolution. Other churches which wouldn't be used for this purpose would be torn down. It wasn't long before de-Christianization was taken out to the departments. At first, the towns and cities surrounding Paris were affected, and their churches were shut down and their priests dispossessed. Later on though, towns and cities further afield would be affected. And therein lies the problem. policies dictated by the Paris Commune were only meant to touch on Paris. The representatives on mission, like Fouché and Chaumette, who were right now carrying out de-Christianization in Lyon, were massively overstepping their bounds. The Committee of Public Safety was effectively shut out of this process. It's not that they specifically opposed de-Christianization, indeed, many committee members were supportive. The problem was that they felt their authority undermined. These fears took on new import as de-Christianization started to face serious resistance. Closing churches in towns and cities where the Jacobins were at their strongest was one thing. Closing them deep in the countryside, in villages where the local church was the linchpin of the community, well, that was another thing entirely. Fears that Vendée-like uprisings might occur close to Paris turned out to be well-founded. In the department of the Yonne, not very far at all from Paris, particularly harsh storms were interpreted as acts of divine retribution. Villagers hurriedly reopened their churches in defiance of the law. Similar events began to occur all over, as villagers forcefully demanded that their churches be reopened. In order to regain control over the situation, the Committee of Public Safety ostensibly sided with these protesters and recalled representatives on mission who were deemed to have gone too far too soon. This included those who had been particularly brutal during the Terror, which will become significant later on. For now though, we return to the Vendée. We left off in about September, and I now want to take us up to early 1794. So, Jean-Antoine Rossignol, a personal favourite of Robespierre and a political appointee to Republican forces in the Vendée, had just presided over a failed counter-offensive. This failure left thousands of Republican troops dead, wounded or captured, and should have confirmed that Rossignol was not fit for duty, despite his rock-solid political credentials. Even still, Rossignol was kept in overall command of the armies of the West due to the continued support of Robespierre and the Hébertistes, but also the on-ground help offered by another political appointee, Charles-Philippe Ronson. An avowed revolutionary to the core, Ronson had accompanied Rossignol to the Vendée, leading his own company of Parisian volunteers. Before that, he had gained a valuable experience in the Ministry of War. Such political boons were the result of Ronson's close cooperation with Hébert, and thus the support of the sections. Now in the Vendée, Ronson planned another offensive, as effective command passed into the hands of a number of other generals. The first was Jean-Baptiste Camille Conclos, who refused to carry out Ronson's plan and charted his own course. Conclos squared off with the Catholic army and suffered 2 defeats, first at Tiffauges and then after retreating at Montaigu, whereupon hundreds of his captured troops were massacred. This left the Catholic army in a great position and resulted in Conclos' dismissal by Minister of War Bouchotte, a dismissal at least partly orchestrated by Ronson. Another general was removed at the same time, leaving 2 army positions to fill. Learning absolutely no lessons from Rossignol's failures, the committee placed Jean Lechelle in command, a man who made Rossignol look positively Napoleonic in his generalship. Lechelle was an extreme example of a political appointee, earning his appointment as a favour from Bouchotte, who was particularly impressed by the young Lechelle's bravery at having defended a representative on mission from a lynching in the aftermath of the surrender at Valenciennes. Bravery really is the only positive thing there is to say about Lechelle. His staff recalled him as being capricious, arrogant, and completely uninterested in strategy or tactics. Nonetheless, the war in the Vendée was not far from a decisive showdown. Closing out September, the Catholic army was seemingly in an excellent position. But this would prove to be the high watermark of the rebellion. For all their success, this was a cruel game of economic arithmetic. Despite Republican losses now numbering tens of thousands, they had the levée en masse on side, and could rely upon fresh, trained troops, new weapons, and consistent provisioning. The rebels, on the other hand, were reliant upon what they could scrounge, the goodwill of the peasants, and sporadic resupply from the British. Worse still, since August, the convention had been flooding the Vendée with reinforcements. Solid veteran formations diverted from the fighting around Mainz were now adding some much-needed strength to the armies of the West. The Republicans felt bold enough to go on the offensive once more. But of course, Lechelle would be the one in charge of planning these offensives. Fortunately for everyone involved, he was far more concerned with army politics, and at the behest of representatives on mission, left the actual planning to a skilled subordinate, Jean-Baptiste Kléber. We'll see more of Kléber down the road, first here in the Vendée, and later on as a man second only to Napoleon in terms of skill and renown. He was the model of a revolutionary general, born poor, rising through the ranks on merit, and achieving martial successes for the Republic. His counterattacks throughout October saw the Republicans recapture many towns they had lost. At first Châtillon on the 11th, and then Bressuire, followed by Cholet on the 15th. Cholet was only recaptured after a major battle at La Tremblay, in which Maurice d'Albret and the Marquis de Bonchamp took cover behind some medieval fortifications. They expected to be aided by François Charette, but for whatever reason he did not come. It wasn't long before a rapid Republican advance forced the rebels back into Cholet. An assault on the town would likely have followed had not Bonchamp and Albay evacuated north towards Beaurepaire. Kléber moved his 20,000 or so men into Cholet on the 16th. His intention was to rest for only the night, ready to press on north to surround Beaurepaire the following day. Prudently, however, Kléber established defences oriented north, and it was against these defences that the rebels crashed on the 17th. Bonchamp and Albay, having limited ammunition, knew that further retreat would simply bleed their army dry. At 40,000 men under arms, this was the strongest they would ever be. They had to achieve a decisive result now or never. Their strategy was not sophisticated: break the Republican lines in the north and pour into Cholet. But rebel tactics were as ever ingenious. They set alight huge hay bales, throwing plumes of thick smoke into the air, which impeded Republican artillery. Under cover of this smoke, they then moved several cannons into favourable positions and blasted the Republican lines. Kléber sent reinforcements, but even so, his troops were soon falling back into the town in disarray. Critically, however, they managed to extricate their artillery. The actual rebel assault on Cholet was led personally by Jean-Nicolas Stofflet and Henri Rochejacquelin, among many others, and they made good progress, even forcing the representatives on mission to flee in fear. But in the confined medieval streets, the numerically inferior Republicans could hold up hundreds of rebels with only a small detachment of men. Ammunition was running low too, forcing the rebels to make essentially suicidal charges against the barricades. With all the rebels' guerrilla advantages sacrificed in street-to-street slogs, the Republicans enjoyed the advantages of sheer firepower. With plenty of ammunition and the rescue cannons deployed to rake entire streets with grape shot, the rebel attacks broke down. Aggressive Republican counterattacks soon broke the rebels. Bonchamp and Albay, as well as Stofflet and Rochejacquelin, were all severely wounded. With no one to give proper orders, the rebels disintegrated. Leaving behind nearly 10,000 killed and wounded, the remnant of the rebel army took refuge in Beaurepaire. Albay, despite suffering what should have been fatal stab wounds, took effective command and ordered a retreat west, hoping to regroup with Charette. But between Charette and Albay was the wide and flowing Loire. Crossing the river with thousands of wounded and only a handful of rickety boats should have been virtually impossible. Certainly Kléber was in no haste to chase them, expecting that they would be mopped up by Dumas' cavalry. That the daring crossing occurred was even more incredible considering that the Catholic army included not only combatants, but an entire baggage train outnumbering the actual army. This included entire families and hangers-on and camp followers, as well as something like 4,000 captured Republican troops, taken over the previous months of fighting. Bonchamp countermanded orders that these prisoners be executed in revenge, a final act before he succumbed to fatal injuries. The Battle of Cholet and the subsequent rebel retreat broke the back of the main force of the Catholic army. Only Charette remained to carry on the fight in the Vendée. Representatives on mission reported back to the convention that the war was now over. These confident assessments of victory, made only days after Cholet, were not, however, entirely accurate. The rebels had not given up, though they were unsure about what their next move should be. Certainly, Albay wouldn't be making any choices in such a serious condition, and after a bit of politicking, command of the army went to the 21-year-old Rochejacquelin. As the Catholic army reconstituted, he determined to seek succour in Brittany, whereupon, it's presumed, Rochejacquelin intended to be resupplied by a British naval squadron, something which did not end up happening. Still, as they went, the rebels took on much-needed supplies and reinforcements, until they had regained much of their lost strength, numbering upwards of 20,000. On October 22nd, they routed a Republican force at Laval. Hot on their heels, though, was Kléber, who had seen the error in allowing the rebels to escape and was now determined to catch them. The two armies met at Antrim on October 27th. The plan of Kléber and his staff was to envelop the town and prevent escape. Lachelle was joined by the representatives on mission and intervened, for some reason, deciding that they would simply attack right down the middle, and do it right now. Predictably, things went poorly, and the Republicans were soundly beaten. Kléber might well have gone to the guillotine for this debacle. But fortunately, the representatives were eager to redirect blame for what, after all, had been their decision. This meant that Lachelle took the blame and was out of the job. He was stripped of command and would, in the coming weeks, commit suicide from within a Nantes jail cell. It was to be Jean-Baptiste Carrier who exerted this pressure. He had joined the army in early October, having been immediately retasked after completing his mission in Normandy. This late arrival made for fully 7 representatives on mission attached to the armies of the West. Again, the committee was taking the Vendée Rebellion extremely seriously. With the worst-case example of Toulon currently under siege and occupied by the Spanish and British, the fear of the committee was that something similar might occur if the rebels could take and hold one of the holdout coastal cities. After all, Saint-Malo had been a close call. Thus, Carrier would divert to Nantes to deal with the Vendée rebels there, but made sure that command of these armies passed into the capable hands of Kléber and Kléber alone, who was promoted to General de Division. Kléber's two most capable subordinates, and personal friends, the brave Marceau and the ruthless Westermann, were accordingly promoted to Generals de Brigade. Together, this formidable trio engaged in running battles with Roche-Jacqueline's retreating force. Carrier was insistent that they cut off the enemy before they reached Granville, I believe the only port city the rebels had managed to capture. Granville was under siege from the Army of the Coast, a siege made apparent by the colossal plumes of smoke which billowed in from inside the port, as fires raged uncontrollably. After seizing the town of Avranches on November 12th, and making cursory attempts at relieving the siege, Roche-Jacqueline abandoned Granville and ran north to Angers, the idea being to cross over the Loire into Brittany proper. There, he hoped, the Catholic army could be rebuilt in friendly territory. But to get there he would have to contend with a rapidly advancing Kléber, who didn't have to worry about tens of thousands of prisoners and civilians in his baggage train. It wasn't long before Kléber caught Roche-Jacqueline at the Dole, where the rebels made a valiant stand for 2 days before being forced to retreat. For the next few weeks, skirmishes between rebels and Republican scouts, mostly hussars, were common things, with a few developing into larger battles. One such battle at La Flèche went to the rebels' favour and gave them just enough breathing space to make it into the city of Le Mans on December 10th, ousting the small garrison there. Kléber and company were less than 2 days out, arriving staggered as their rapid advance had necessitated. This made them susceptible to ambushes on the road to Le Mans. Westermann's brigade of 3,000 men was surrounded and faced annihilation, only to be saved by the timely arrival of Republican reinforcements from a recently recaptured Granville. Marceau arrived on scene not long after, trailed by Kléber and the main force. Even with only a few thousand men, Westermann convinced Marceau to take Le Mans now, before the rebels had a chance to prepare. The result was a daring afternoon assault that took an exhausted Roche-Jacqueline by surprise. Despite outnumbering the Republicans maybe 2-1, his forces were racked by disease and desertion, and were completely demoralized after having run for so long and fighting all the while on empty stomachs. In the urban fighting that followed, cannons again made a frightening appearance, being used to demolish entire buildings or clear streets with peals of grape shot. Roche-Jacqueline took what forces would rally and fled Le Mans, following the Loire south with maybe 10,000 men. The small rearguard left behind was quickly destroyed, however, as Dumas' cavalry pursued. The cover of darkness didn't help. With sabres and carbines, the hussars cut down hundreds of fleeing rebels. Many of those who did not die melted away into the forests. Dawn revealed the extent of the slaughter. Of the 20,000 plus fighters Roche-Jacqueline had commanded on the morning of the 12th, most had been either blown apart in Le Mans or were strewn across the banks of the Loire. A large portion had been captured, with less than half of the initial force remaining to regroup in Laval on the 14th. This defeat, however devastating, need not have been the end of the Catholic army. After all, they had suffered similarly devastating defeats before, and then rebounded. But this battle was to prove the end. Even before the fighting had started, the rebels had all but lost the will to fight, afflicted as they were by numerous camp diseases, a complete lack of food or ammunition, and the breakdown in morale caused by consistent defeats. Over the next few days and weeks, the Catholic army would simply cease to be, its soldiers deserting, its officers fleeing. This included Roche-Jacqueline, who disguised himself and fled deep into the Loire Valley, hoping to lead a guerrilla campaign. Really, such crippling losses among the soldiers was to be expected. In every sense, this was a war to the death for both sides. What was less than chivalrous was the Republicans' maltreatment of the captured camp followers, rebel prisoners, and even the innocent citizens of Le Mans. Despite liberating a French town from royalist rebels, the Republican troops spent most of the night and most of the following days looting, raping, and pillaging. Kléber and Marceau tried to stop them, but the men were uncontrollable. The representatives on mission were quick to mete out their own revolutionary justice, and order the mass executions of thousands of captured rebels. A rebel was taken to mean a broad swath of those captured, whether or not they were indeed rebels. Orders from the Committee of Public Safety were explicit: do not kill civilians, but the distinction was generally ignored. Certainly, it didn't matter to Carrier. He, in particular, furthered his own reputation for callous cruelty by psychologically torturing his victims and writing extremely gratuitous letters back to Paris. This irked Kléber, who petitioned Carrier to show mercy. This ended up being a mistake. Kléber was dismissed from service after having essentially won the war, and would likely have been guillotined if not for the intercession of powerful advocates in Paris. That was a good choice, as he would be recalled to service in April and spend the next 6 years of his life performing quite well under trying circumstances. Marceau, I might add, was dismissed too for having personally intervened to prevent the execution of a young lady. He succeeded only in delaying said execution, however, and would later join Kléber, ultimately falling in battle in 1796. Westermann stood out among the three. He had not tried to prevent his men from looting, and indeed was apparently quite pleased that they had dispatched all the prisoners without care. In a report to the committee he stated, "There is no more Vendée. It has perished under our free sword, along with its women and children. I have buried it in the mud and marshes of Savenay. Following the orders that you gave me, I have crushed children under the hooves of horses, and massacred women who at least will give birth to no more brigands. I have no prisoners with which to reproach myself." Evidently, Westermann was executing a policy of extermination, a policy started months prior at the height of the rebels' success. Since the rebels employed guerrilla warfare, a brigands' war in the words of Republican officers, the decision was made to fight back with ruthless abandon. Summary executions of captured rebels and the destruction of their homes and villages were frequent occurrences. The Committee of Public Safety retroactively endorsed this stance, deciding that since such wanton carnage was essentially inevitable in such a brutal war, they might as well get some utility out of it by striking fear into the heart of the rebels. Now that the Catholic army was destroyed and the rebels were either dead or fleeing, this policy of brutal repression kicked into high gear. Not only were thousands killed at Le Mans, 200 prisoners were butchered in Angers, and another 2,000 at Saint-Florent. It was to be in Nantes, though, where the most wholesale and most infamous of these episodes occurred. Every prisoner for miles around was emptied, and the prisoners sent to Nantes. These prisoners consisted not merely of captured rebels, but those who had been imprisoned by revolutionary authorities for later trial and execution. The largest portion of these poor sods was made up of priests. Awaiting them in Nantes was Jean-Baptiste Carrier, who soon found himself busy organising dozens of trials and executions. His work had started in November, but near the end of the month, he was chafing at the torpid pace imposed by a trial and then an execution. Both were too slow. So he cut out the fat, perfunctory trials and no more guillotine. At first, it was the priests who would suffer under Carrier's new system. Under cover of night, they were taken in batches, tied together, and huddled into barges, which were then hauled and sunk. Carrier's self-dubbed vertical deportations saw hundreds of priests drown in the Loire. From November to February, these executions continued, now extended out to include all other prisoners. They were stripped naked and then dumped into the river, their arms and legs bound. Sometimes, men and women would be lashed together and then drowned as a couple, a so-called Republican marriage. In all, at least a few thousand were killed at Nantes, drowned, guillotined, or shot. The mass execution of prisoners was complemented by a military campaign to pacify the countryside. Entire villages were destroyed, literally wiped off the map, their communities at best uprooted, at worst executed en masse, dispersed throughout France, or deported to Madagascar. Such policies were the work of none other than Jean-Antoine Rossignol, backed by Ronson. Disgraced in battle, Rossignol found a chance to redeem himself in the eyes of the Committee of Public Safety by getting his hands dirty in the Vendée cleanup. But by the end of February, even these repressive measures were not enough. There was still resistance, and villagers continued to offer aid to the rebels. Sheer terror, pure and primal, was deemed to be the only way to finally snuff out the last flickers of rebellion. General Louis-Marie Turreau, in March of 1794, was given the task of carrying out this pacification. Turreau had planned for this since January, and as per his plans, 12 columns would range out of their bases to loot, pillage and destroy literally everything in their paths. Nothing and no one were to be spared. In only a few short months, tens of thousands would be put to the sword, the men executed, the children slaughtered, the women raped. These were the dreaded colonnes infernales, the infernal columns. The total death toll varies. Biased sources list as many as 250,000. A more reasonable 40,000 seems likely. But what's not in doubt is that the Vendée mop-up may well constitute a genocide. There is a technical definition of genocide, of which it falls short, for what it's worth. Strictly speaking, genocide committed against one's own people is not a genocide. An argument, again, for what it's worth, I don't agree with. Plenty of the 6 million plus Jews who died during the Holocaust were or had been German citizens. Uyghurs currently suffering cultural extermination are Chinese citizens, and these two events definitely meet the definition of a genocide. It's also worth bearing in mind the Committee of Public Safety and the relevant revolutionary authorities wholeheartedly endorsed the indiscriminate slaughter of the population of the Vendée. They not only knew about it, they ordered it. By around April, this process was complete. The Vendée was a wasteland. Where villages had once existed, there were now only mass graves and burned-out ruins. With no food or manpower to sustain their fight, Charette and Stofflet were essentially forced to lay down their arms. Both would reluctantly sign on to the Peace of La Journée, which was meant to formally end the War in the Vendée. This happened in February of 1795, but within only a few weeks, Charette and Stoffelet were back in the field, leading another royalist insurgency. Both men would end up captured and shot. So for now, we're done with the Vendée. We'll return there eventually, but for now at least, we'll roll back the clock a bit and get back to Paris politics. Things are heating up in the capital, with the Hébertists' continued attacks reaching intolerable levels. Robespierre of the Jacobin Club won't stand this onslaught for long. But even still, the Hébertists are only one faction out for blood. The fallout between former friends and revolutionary comrades, Danton and Robespierre, will reach the breaking point. Their mutually exclusive visions for the future of the revolution driving them to extreme measures. So it's a three-way struggle. The radical Hébertists, the empowered Jacobins, and the proud Dantonists, all locked in a bloody fight to the death, winner takes all.